performance of the persona is quite all right, as long as you know that you are not identical with the way in which you appear.
So today you've got two men who are supposedly in politics in opposition, Bush and Harriman, actually the members of the same secret society, people who appear to be in opposition politically or financially or industrially or in many ways are working together.
Welcome to another episode of Confronting Sophistry. I'm Jeff DeRiso, and today I want to talk about how we can create a better system of education. It has often been said that it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. Now, if you've seen my previous episodes and you've observed the world around you with a critical mind, you can see that not many people live up to that standard. I've talked previously on this show about the phenomena of people who consider themselves to be skeptics or debunkers. And the funny thing about those people is that their skepticism seems to only be aimed at people who question conventional wisdom, and it's never aimed at the people who perpetuate that conventional wisdom and that official narrative. You'll often hear them say, well, I don't believe in conspiracy theories, but in fact they do believe in conspiracy theories. They just only believe the unsubstantiated and unproven conspiracy theories promoted by our own government. They'll believe a conspiracy theory as long as the Syrian government or the Russian government is the bad guy. So it's not that they don't believe in conspiracy theories, it's just that they don't believe anything outside of the narrative of the official authority of our government. These so-called skeptics are arguing from a foundational presupposition that authority figures are always right. So when somebody questions that official narrative, their immediate reaction is to be skeptical of the person questioning and not of the narrative itself. Because the narrative, in their eyes, is infallible because it's given by an authority. So that's funny because if you see science as somehow this authority, you have to understand that 100 years ago, what scientists knew was a lot different than what scientists know now. So in 100 years from now, scientists are going to know a lot of things that contradicts what they think they know today.
1,500 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was the center of the universe. 500 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was flat, and 15 minutes ago, you knew that people were alone on this planet.
Imagine what you'll know tomorrow.
That is one of the very basic reasons that I made this show, because once I woke up to the idea that official narratives and conventional wisdom may be wrong, I sought out other sources of information, and I found that many of those other sources of information fell into those same traps of the ego in wanting to be right all the time. And I've heard the comedian Bill Burr point out that the internet hasn't really driven the discourse forward because everyone just goes to imright.com and copies and pastes that into their argument. So the majority of people aren't really thinking about the problem, they're just looking for information and documents that are going to back up what they've already decided that they believe. So the lack of truly good teachers is what inspired me to create this show. I wanted to create a space to be able to question an official narrative without perpetuating an ego-driven mentality of I'm right and you're wrong. That's not a very good way to convince somebody of your argument. A good teacher doesn't put themselves on a pedestal and hand out decrees of this is how the world is. A good teacher helps you form a method to employ in your own life to decide what is true and what is false. Let's be honest. It feels good to be right. It feels good when you're in a group of people and you have a disagreement with somebody. It feels good if other people in that group hear your argument and they say, you know what? He's right. I'll change my mind about that because you've convinced me. That feels really, really good. And a lot of us fall into this trap of getting addicted to that feeling. And I've fallen into it myself. I'm not immune from this very human struggle of wanting to be right about things. But I had to learn to confront that within myself in order to get beyond that ego-driven mentality. This brings me to the first question I want to pose today. What is the goal of our modern education system? To begin to answer this question, I want to point you to a great article I read by Jay Dyer called Modern Education is Pavlovian Conditioning. And if you're not familiar with Pavlov and his conditioning experiments, he was able to condition his dogs to react to the sound of a bell and associate that sound of a bell with eating food. And even when he took the food away and he just rang the bell, the dogs still salivated like they were hungry because they had been conditioned to associate the sound of the bell with eating. So in a similar way, what Jay talks about in his article, the United States public education system has its roots in the Prussian system. And the Prussian system was a way to condition and socialize people to blindly accept the authority of the state. So that explains a lot of where we are today and why the inevitable products of our public education system are not truly educated people, but rather people who blindly accept the will and the reasoning of figures in authority. People often say that our public education system is broken, but what Jay talks about in the article is that the system is actually doing exactly what it was designed to do from the very beginning. A group of extremely wealthy industrialists, through the guise of benevolence and charity, have hijacked our education system to promote their agenda of a collectivist, one-world oligarchy. Now, this fact is borne out by the evidence in a document called the Dodd Report to the Reese Committee, which was a congressional committee investigating the influence and the practices of nonprofit foundations in the United States. And what they found was that these foundations were using their extreme wealth to tip the scales of the goals of public education in their favor to serve an agenda of their own utopian society, which is a world socialist collectivist state with them and their friends at the head of it. We see that the goal of our own public education system, modeled after the Prussian system, is indoctrination. Indoctrination to what? A belief in the infallibility of authority. In my eyes, the real flaw of our education system is that it encourages us to build assumptions on top of assumptions. So we become more likely to accept the dogmatic proclamations of people like Stephen Hawking or Neil deGrasse Tyson, but a lot less likely to read the works of the controversial author Immanuel Velikovsky. I've often made the observation and laughed and joked about this with my friends. When somebody says something in a very confident tone, people are just more likely to believe them. Even if the logic of their argument is complete bullshit, it doesn't matter. People are thinking, well, this person really sounds like they know what they're talking about. I should just repeat what they're saying because that'll make me sound smart. So if somebody uses what I would call an educated mind, where they don't stake a claim one way or the other, those people are considered less intelligent. So it's really this upside down, backwards world that's been created through the system of social conditioning that is supposedly called public education. What it really seeks to do is create a mythos of what the intellectual is supposed to be, and that mythos creates a class of people who are very preachy and dogmatic in the same way that a clergyman might be, but instead of speaking about spiritual topics, they're speaking about what is and what is not empirically true in the world. So when you hear a scientist speaking with a tone of authority and saying, well, the universe was created in the Big Bang, and can you really say that with 100% authority? It's disingenuous to speak with 100% authority and say that you know how the universe was created. And since 2015, there have been articles coming out of physicists doing experiments that actually disprove the Big Bang Theory. But wait, I thought Neil deGrasse Tyson said in Cosmos that was definitely how the universe was created, and if you don't believe that, you're a religious nut job. Well, no. That was the scientific establishment promoting a false dichotomy to prop themselves up as authority figures because they suffer from the same delusional, ego-driven mentality of, well, the best and the brightest experts out there are saying this, so anybody who contradicts that doesn't have a good argument. That's insanity. So many people think that while primary and secondary education has its problems, that somehow the university system is immune to that indoctrination and that it's this pure bastion of liberal democratic values and true knowledge seeking. When in fact, the university has perfected indoctrination to a higher degree. There's a professor at UC Davis named Dr. Daryl Hamamoto who calls out the very deception and underhanded tactics used by administrators in the university systems to promote specific agendas, and those agendas have been definitively linked to nonprofit foundations. And don't take my word for that, look it up yourself. They'll say, well, of course we have an agenda. Our agenda is to educate all humankind and to create a more fair system where everyone can be educated. But if you have to resort to deception in order to achieve your goal, I would argue that your goal can't be benevolent, because why would you have to lie about it if that goal truly was for the good of everyone? You wouldn't have to. You could openly discuss it and have an open debate of ideas. So any person that calls themselves an educator and is trying to close down and shut down an open discussion of ideas is a complete fraud. That fraud is incentivized within the university system, and that's what people like Dr. Hamamoto talk about. One of the unintended consequences of this indoctrination disguised as education is that amongst the uneducated, you have a backlash against intellectualism. And that's completely understandable because the people who are presented as the intellectuals are full of shit.
I believe in science.
But the problem with that is, it's not really intellectualism that's the enemy, it's this fake version of intellectualism that has created a blind obedience amongst the masses to state authority. So to place the blame on intellectualism is really not productive either, because that which is presented to us as intellectualism is actually sophistry. I can see how people resent the so-called experts telling us what to think and what to do and what to feel, but at the same time, we should not allow that to discourage us from educating ourselves. Just because the people who are the so-called educated classes are full of shit doesn't mean education is not valuable. It just means that what is presented to us as education is really indoctrination. So if we can just call things what they are, we can have a much clearer view of the world instead of getting caught up in this dialectic of worldviews that are further and further detached from what is actually reality. If there's ever a teacher who does not encourage you to question their own teachings, you should run as fast as you can in the opposite direction. The greatest teacher is somebody who admits that they themselves are also a student. It's what in the Buddhist tradition is called the beginner's mind. When you have a beginner's mind, you're able to entertain ideas without assuming that you know the answers. And if you always work from that point of assuming that you know nothing, you'll become educated in the more classical definition of education, which is being open-minded to views that contradict your current views. So now we've come to that point where we have to decide, what is it that we need to do? If you've watched my previous episodes, you know that our political system is completely corrupt, and it goes back to central bankers who have limitless amount of financial power and are able to pull strings and grease the wheels to serve their agenda. What we really have to do is opt out of it. We really have to create our own system that's a new option that encourages education in the true definition of the word and not indoctrination and social conditioning under the disguise of education. So what are the alternatives? Many people promote the idea of charter schools, which are basically just private institutions of education. I don't personally know any stories of people who have had experiences in charter schools, but I can tell you that a charter school is just as likely to be promoting indoctrination as a public school, because if there's money involved, we know that the wheels can be greased to support the agenda of the people who have most of the money. Whatever alternative method we choose, it really just has to be based in a foundation of determining what is the truth. One of the classical educational methods for determining truth in this way is called the Trivium method. The Trivium method basically consists of 3 interconnected parts, and those are grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Now, grammar is where we define what words mean and how to put them together in a way that adequately expresses a thought. And then logic is the next step, where we are able to put multiple thoughts together in order to form a conclusion about what is and is not true. And then that third branch is rhetoric, where we then go forth and discuss what we have found, and we hone that idea further by speaking about it with others and trying to persuade them and being persuaded by them. So these 3 points in this trivium triangle are interconnected in that any one by itself isn't enough to educate yourself. You have to apply all 3 in conjunction in order to truly get the effect of this method. The other thing I would mention is that there's no shortcut to finding the truth in most cases. So as long as you have that methodology, you're going to have to apply that through trial and error in order to learn new things. And the best way to learn new things is to try. And if you have an attitude of always wanting to be right, you're going to be afraid to try. But if you have an attitude of a beginner's mind, of always wanting to seek new knowledge to improve yourself, you're going to want to try new things, but you're not going to be afraid of failing. Because that fear of failure is what is stopping people from learning new things and accepting the true reality that is all around us. The best way for us to educate the next generation is not to tell them that they have to believe that the government is corrupt and that GMOs are bad and that chemtrails are poisoning us. We don't have to tell them what to think. We have to teach them the methods that we used to figure things out, and either they will come to that same conclusion on their own, or they will use those methods to disprove us. And we'll have to then accept that we were wrong about something and congratulate our kids for using the proper methods of determining the truth. If we can remain open to the possibility that we might be wrong about something, then we can be proper educators, because we're not going to then stand in judgment of people and turn them away from the truth by ridiculing them and telling them they're stupid because they haven't figured out what we figured out. Because there was once a time where you and I did not understand what we understand now. So if we can put ourselves in that position every time we approach somebody who questions us, then we can be the educators and we can be the good examples for the world. If somebody doesn't understand something that you understand, ridiculing them and making fun of them isn't going to help them understand it. If anything, it's going to turn them away from that completely. So that's why every once in a while I'll make fun of people if they're really asking for it, but at the same time I'm not trying to divide people and say people in this group are bad people because they believe X, Y, and Z. I think that anybody can see the truth if their mind is open to it, and if somebody has the patience to walk them through the methods for determining what that truth is. If we can start a new pattern in society of teachers who have the patience to really go through step by step and explain the logic of how they got to their conclusions, then we're already on the way to producing a better system that's a better alternative than our current public education system. So if we're honest about our education, we can admit when we have made a conclusion that was incorrect. And I don't see a lot of people in both the mainstream and the alternative media spheres doing that. So we're going to start doing that. We're going to start setting that example in the world. Because our educational system has encouraged us to build assumptions on top of assumptions, what that leads to is a number of scientific theories that are based on complete nonsense. So in the next episode, what I want to do is break down where we've gone wrong in fields of scientific research. And remember, it's better to approach the world with a beginner's mind and always be open to the fact that you may have made a mistake. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Confronting Sophistry. I'm Jeff DeRiso, and I'll see you next time.